Well, let me just open up by saying one of the reasons I suppose that I'm even here is because I've been giving a lot of thought about well, contemporary Tibetan art and traditional forms. And this is sort of in preparation for this exhibition which I'm engaged in at the Met, which opens, I guess, February 8th. You all have to come. It's called India in Tibet, Buddhist Traditions and Transformations. I'll just go to my Buddha. And the basic premise of that show is really sort of playing with this idea or examining how Buddhist ideas, came out of India and came up into Tibet in the 11th century. Really, is what I'm focusing on. And I think it's an interesting question, in light of this idea of how cultures receive other cultures' images and their ideas. And in many ways, that sort of touches on what you were talking about as well. But let me just think about this strictly from a Buddhist perspective, at least at the outset. I wanted to begin with an image like this crowned Buddha. This is produced in North India in the 10th or the 11th century. It's the kind of image that one would have found in the huge monasteries that sort of dotted the landscape in Bihar. Places like Nalanda, Vikramashila, the Mahabodhi Temple. So these were all major centers that major educational centers, places that you would go to study Buddhism. People from Tibet were coming down to places like the Mahabodhi Temple for pilgrimage, but then they were going to the big monasteries where they were studying Buddhism, translating texts. And images like this one were finding their way back to Tibet. I mean, this is a nice portable object. It's made out of lost wax, cast bronze. So, I mean, I guess the halo detaches, but the rest of it's one piece. You could throw it in your backpack and off you would go. I mean, it's easily moved. It's also, because of its scale, something that you could put in lots of different contexts. In other words, it probably was it's the kind of image that you would use personally. I mean, it would fit into a cell, right? A monk could put that in a cell and venerate it directly. I suppose you could say it's the kind of an object that is, I mean, it's not 8 feet tall, it's little. It's the kind of thing that maybe someone gave to the monastery as well, gave to the religious area. I mean, they cast it or had it cast and gave it as a pious donation. So it does sort of, I mean, it involves, I mean, it nicely sort of ties in sort of a lay donation practice, a monastic community who's using it, and then a foreign community that's, maybe hauling this thing back and recontextualizing it. And I sort of started here and wanted to think about this particular Buddha image because it gets right at the sort of this horribly snarled and complex issue of esoteric Buddhism, which you brought up a second ago, and how images were understood by different communities. If you notice, I mean, he's touching the earth. I mean, he's at the moment of enlightenment. I mean, we know that right at that moment, he touched the earth, called the earth to witness his past actions, and reaches enlightenment. The fact that it's an enlightenment narrative works well because we have up here, you have some Bodhi tree branches with some Bodhi leaves. So this is probably at Bodh Gaya. So here he's touching the earth. But then you have this very odd thing of him wearing this crown and having all these great jewels. Let me just show you the base. Isn't this thing flashy? I mean, to my knowledge, this is the only example where you can still see the original inlay. See all this nice lapis here, rock crystal. If I go back. I mean, the whole image would have been, look at all of these, it would have been stones inlaid in all of these little things, all through the base and the figure. In other words, it would have been really lavish. And this hardly really even fits with the idea of the Buddha reaching enlightenment, right? At Bodh Gaya, he has renounced the world. Why in the world is he wearing jewels and a crown? Also, note all the great silver inlay. See, like around his head, his eyes. Fabulous little image, really flashy, you know. So, a total contradiction. And why would something like this be so popular and travel up to Tibet? You know, I mean, you know, it's sort of why would a crowned Buddha have this kind of traction? So I gave it a lot of thought. There's a huge scholarship, I should just note, on crowned Buddhas. Everyone has argued about them for, you know, the history of Buddhist studies, because it's such a contradiction. Why does a renunciant who has supposedly given up all the trappings of the palace, you know, why are we seeing all of this? And why would this particular image be so popular in terms of moving outside of India? When I first started studying the topic, I immediately leapt to the idea that it was Maitreya. Now, maybe you know who Maitreya is. I'll give you a 2-second Maitreya. The Buddha reaches enlightenment, right? But he's not the first Buddha, right? There's this idea that when he reached enlightenment, he was actually walking in the footsteps of a whole series of Buddhas of past ages. That he was actually not the first, not the second, not the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, but maybe the sixth one, or sometimes the seventh one, or sometimes the 24th one. But he was one in a long series of Buddhas that preceded him. And they all were born in the very same place, Lumbini. They all reached enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, and so on. They live, in fact, the very same life, ultimately die leaving relics. So, I mean, so Shakyamuni was just doing as part of this whole series. And once we've completely forgotten Buddhism and everything, there is a bodhisattva residing up in a heaven waiting to be reborn, right? That's Maitreya, and here he is with a crown. Because he's not yet been born. He's the future Buddha. So after we've forgotten everything, he'll be born. And so then his wearing a crown, sitting up in a heaven, sort of makes sense, because he's not a Buddha yet. He's still waiting to be a Buddha. He's, in a sense, living up in a heaven in the realm of the gods. He has yet to give up the life of the palace, and so on. It's sort of almost fitting that he would be dressed like a god. And so we have this crown. And notice also he's wearing this wonderful jeweled cape and things. I should just note that this image is in the Potala collection in Lhasa, probably produced in Western Tibet, and kind of comes out of the area of Himachal Pradesh and going into Western Tibet. So one way, anyways, that these crowned Buddhas came up into the region. Okay. So when we look at him again, we could say, well, great, so he's Maitreya. Doesn't quite work because he's reaching enlightenment, but it's a sort of, at least we start to understand maybe why this appeal is there. So I started sort of really being troubled by the fact that there would be this fluidity, and was looking around and reading the scholarship, and other things have been suggested. These little Andaku plaques were being produced also in India, a little bit further east. These are sort of in the area of Bengal, Bangladesh sort of area. It's a mudstone. They're about that tall. And here, notice we have almost the same iconography. It's the Buddha reaching enlightenment. Here he's reaching down. There are the little Bodhi tree branches. Right, so we have the very same scene. Only here he's surrounded by all the life events. So we, in a sense, have placed him right into the context of pilgrimage and the places of the Buddhist heartland. So here he is being born. There's his mother. She's reaching up to grab the branch, and he's popping out of her side. Here he's teaching the first sermon. This one's pretty broken, but he's taming the elephant Nalagiri. It's a complete wreck over here. Oh, excuse me. Complete wreck over here, but it would be the offering of the honey. He converts people in Shravasti. He descends after his teaching his mother the path to enlightenment, and here's his death, right? So they're all surrounding, him reaching enlightenment. This is really sort of classic great pilgrimage sites and showing the Buddha in this context. Now, interestingly, on the base, we are given these little group of symbols. Now, let me just go back. So there they are. Oh, and if we look carefully, it's an elephant, a flaming jewel, a general, a wheel. These are all symbols of the Chakravartin. So when the Buddha was born, he could either have become a great world leader, conquered the world, been the ideal monarch. I mean, he had that merit, right? He had gone through these countless births and could have done that. Or he could become a religious mendicant. I mean, he, in other words, had the potential to reach enlightenment or become a great king. He chooses to reach enlightenment, but he could have been a great king. And these symbols of the Chakravartin sort of mark this whole status of possibly being a king. And I bring that up because of the idea of a crown, right? So here he is almost crowned like a king, like a Chakravartin. And so we have this nice analogy. Another way to skin that cat and put a crown on the Buddha. He is the one who reaches enlightenment and goes on to teach the path to enlightenment. To offer the path, the Buddhist path. But here he has also that status. And I just took this picture last winter, actually, at Antichak, which is Vikramashila, one of the great centers that we know all the Tibetans were coming down to. Probably the most important of the monasteries in North India. And here we get exactly that same iconography, only now with a crown. So I suppose at this point I thought, well, God, great, it's regionally specific. We have people up in the Himalayas making them into Maitreya. We have people in Vikramashila playing this interesting Chakravartin game. And in that kind of light, when you start to think of these different ways that one might spin it, an image like this is then multivalent. I mean, it has multiple meanings. It means different things for different communities. It actually then becomes a better Buddha image in many ways. And unfortunately, just to make it really complicated, sort of annoyingly so, I started really looking through the scholarship and thinking of where there were crowns, and great scholar Bautza Pakran, Claudine Bautza Pakran, pointed out that this Buddha is being crowned. Now this guy is from Gandhara, the region that I've been studying my whole career. It's probably a 3rd century AD image, really early. And here we have the Buddha, he's teaching, he's holding his hands in Dharmachakra mudra, and he still sits on a lotus, and he's being crowned. These little guys fly in and they're about to crown him. And to my mind, no one's really ever given a satisfactory explanation of this thing. Bautza Pakran suggested that it was Vairocana, and she presents this whole complicated argument, which I think is wrong, personally. So, I don't agree with her at all, but she is right about him being crowned. And I thought that was really interesting, if not troubling. And she pointed out that in West India, you have lots and lots of these guys sitting on lotus thrones being donated, and some of them are being crowned. See the little guys bringing in the crown? I just love it. So here we are, all the way back, in sort of the earlier period, and I started really wondering, and to get back to the whole esoteric question, how does this tie into that esoteric tradition and Vajrayana and Tantra, and how that might appeal, again, to our Tibetan community. And here, let me just read it. So Deborah Klimberg-Salter argues that out of the Yoga Tantra, that at the moment of the enlightenment, the Buddha left his physical body, right at the moment that he touches the earth and reaches enlightenment. And he goes up into the highest level of heaven in a mind-made body, where the Buddhas of the 10 directions bestow upon him the 5 stages of perfect enlightenment, and as marked by the formulas of self-consecration. And this self-consecration is described in terms of a coronation, hence the crown, right? I just think it's so neat and tidy. So he's crowned at that stage, and at that moment he becomes the perfect universal Buddha, Vairocana. The very same one I mentioned just a minute ago. Vairocana sits at the cosmic axis of the universe, and only after having taught the Yoga Tantra to a host of celestial beings at the summit of Mount Meru, at the cosmic center of the universe, he descends back to his physical body at Bodh Gaya, and reaches enlightenment and becomes Shakyamuni. I just think it's so neat and tidy. And you can sort of see again, that we have the crown and this crowned Buddha form then being pulled right into the Yoga Tantra, which of course, well, or I shouldn't say of course, in the 11th century was quite popular in Tibet. It was a tantra that had great sort of traction, and people were paying a lot of attention to. And this idea of Vairocana sitting at the cosmic center and there being Buddhas going into 4 directions and residing over Pure Lands was a major tradition. So it's clear then that or at least what emerged to me out of all of this and thinking about this, is that you have Buddha images that have sort of, I think, a range of possibilities that are appealing for lots of different reasons. That's sort of what travels most easily, and that's what has the greatest oomph. I mean, when you really think, what is this image anyways but a little piece of propaganda, in a sense, or something that you can hang Buddhist ideology on? It's just actually a little piece of metal, right? I mean, so you're attaching all this meaning to it, and what kinds of meanings you can attach are always interesting questions. So here we are up in Tibet proper, and I show you a huge thangka that I'm actually going to include in my exhibition. It's 11th or perhaps 12th century. Maybe I'm being even a little too ambitious to say 11th, but right about the same period as our crowned Buddha. This guy doesn't exactly have a crown. He has sort of diadems, and I mean, his headdress is a little different, but notice all the jewels, yeah? And he's wearing jewels on his arms, and it's fancy things. He sits on this great lotus throne, right? So the iconography is very, very similar. Here we know he's Amitayus. He holds this little pot filled with Amrita, the elixir of immortality. Amitayus is venerated for longevity, for health. I mean, he has that kind of meaning. But notice how when I was mentioning him and I was talking about this celestial realm, right, and all the gods coming down to hear him preach the Yoga Tantra, how here we're finding this now celestial Buddha flanked by bodhisattvas in a celestial realm. I mean, it's all that iconography is now being recontextualized. It's being reused. It's being rethought in a sense. Amitayus isn't the same deity, but I think that food for thought is quite interesting, and that this iconography isn't so rigidly fixed. It's open to interpretation. It's appealing because it can be used in new and creative ways. I know I'm running out of time. I'm good. Well, so all of this made me think then about the contemporary tradition and thinking really about Buddha images. An artist named Gankar Gyatso is contributing this image called Dissected Buddha, which you really can't see terribly well, but it's about that big. So, I mean, if you really actually had it properly projected, you could see all the captions and everything. It's a modern Buddha. But one of the things that struck me right off the bat when I started thinking about an image like this, which has become very popular. I mean, Gankar is one of the people he's done these Buddha images, and people have related to them, I think, in large part because it's an image of the Buddha, much like my crowned Buddha. Perhaps one difference is that it's now a Buddha that is also a personal self-expression. It's his creation as opposed to an anonymous creation, getting back to your anonymity. Anonymity actually is great in the sense that it sort of almost suggests universality. And I think he's playing with that idea a little bit, but at the same time isn't. And one of the things that if you start to zoom in on this, he's basically done the Buddha as a collage. And a collage of things that are kind of immediately recognizable. I mean, we have McDonald's and pandas and all these little stickers of things like Best Buy and save $30. And I mean, to my mind, it really starts to look like the noise coming through the internet. All this sort of mass media that's being bombarded at us. And I mean, you know, and in talking with Gankar, he has all these sort of things of, he always will say things like, well, when is the Buddha not the Buddha? Which I think is interesting because in a sense you're not seeing the Buddha. Maybe all you're seeing is all this noise, which is almost more interesting than seeing the Buddha. It's almost sort of like, you know, we can no longer apprehend the Buddha because all we really do is look at all this garbage that's in our way, you know. But, you know, one of many ways of starting to play with it, and I think that this is one of the things that I personally find most interesting about what's happening today with all this contemporary tradition. I mean, that people are starting to explore these same ideas of ideology and meaning, and sort of creatively rethinking about how one might present it to a new audience. I mean, and if you think about that anonymous artist making the crown Buddha, which made its way to Tibet, this object is really kind of now making its way into a global context, and, you know, is reaching sort of a new audience as opposed to its original, if it had an original audience. It's a good question. Lots of problems with the contemporary moment.